It was supposed to be the perfect family outing. Devil's Den State Park, tucked deep within the rolling hills and dense forests of northwest Arkansas, was a place known for its rugged beauty and peaceful trails. The late summer sun filtered through the trees, painting the path with streaks of gold. Birds chirped overhead, and the gentle sound of running water followed hikers along the creeks and waterfalls. For the Stevens family, this was their escape, a break from the noise of daily life. Jason Stevens, 44, walked at the front, his well-worn hiking boots crunching against the gravel path. His wife, Laura, 42, was just a few steps behind, laughing softly as their two kids, Emily, 8, and Noah, 6, raced ahead, chasing each other under the dappled sunlight. They had been to Devil's Den many times before, and every visit felt like a reset button for the family. Nature had a way of making everything feel safe. But on this day, safety was an illusion. A stranger on the trail. Somewhere along the winding Butterfield hiking trail, Jason noticed another hiker in the distance. At first, nothing seemed unusual. This was a popular route, after all. The man appeared to be in his late 30s, tall, wearing a dark cap and carrying a backpack that looked far heavier than normal. He walked slowly, as if pacing himself, but something about the way he kept glancing over his shoulder caught Jason's attention. The stranger stopped at a trail marker, pretending to check a map. Jason led his family past him with a polite nod, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he watched them go, his expression unreadable. Laura felt it too. "That guy gave me the creeps," she whispered once they were a few steps ahead. Jason shrugged it off. "Probably just tired. Don't overthink it." Neither of them knew that the man behind them wasn't a harmless hiker. He was carrying a knife and an agenda. The moment everything changed. As they reached a narrow stretch of the trail bordered by thick brush, Jason heard footsteps speeding up behind them. Before he could turn, the stranger was there, knife drawn, his breathing quick and heavy. The attack came without warning. The peaceful sounds of the forest vanished, replaced by screams. Laura grabbed the kids, pulling them toward the side of the trail, while Jason tried to shield his family. But the man lunged at him with terrifying force, slashing wildly. The smell of pine and dirt mixed with the metallic scent of blood as chaos erupted in the quiet wilderness. Emily and Noah were frozen in shock, watching their parents fight for their lives in the place they thought was safest. Panic in the wilderness. Laura tried to push the attacker away, yelling for help, but the isolated trail swallowed her voice. Jason was bleeding badly. The stranger's face twisted in rage as he struck again, ignoring the children's sobs. For a split second, their attacker locked eyes with the kids. That chilling moment would stay with them forever. The only thought running through Laura's mind was to get the children away. Fast. But the path ahead was blocked by the man who seemed determined to finish what he had started. This wasn't a random encounter. It was something much darker. And before the day was over, Devil's Den would become a crime scene burned into Arkansas history. The morning of May 8th began with the kind of beauty that makes you forget the world's dangers. The Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas was bathed in golden sunlight, with its winding trails, ancient rock formations, and the soothing sound of Cedar Creek's flowing waters. Families, hikers, and campers had filled the park to enjoy spring's perfect weather. Among them were James and Kimberly Bryant, a loving couple in their mid-30s, and their two children, aged 6 and 8. The Bryants had been coming to Devil's Den for years. For them, it wasn't just a park. It was a tradition. They would hike the Yellow Rock Trail, take pictures at the overlook, and end the day with a picnic near the water. That Saturday, they were doing exactly that. But by sunset, their children would be screaming in terror, and the family tradition would turn into a scene of unimaginable horror. The stranger on the trail. Witnesses later recalled seeing a lone man on the trail that day. He was in his late 20s, tall, with an unshaven face, wearing a dark hoodie despite the warm weather. He carried no backpack or visible hiking gear, unusual for someone deep inside the park. Some hikers described his demeanor as off, quiet, yet intensely watchful, as if studying everyone he passed. Unbeknownst to the Bryants, This man had been shadowing them for nearly half an hour, keeping his distance, occasionally stopping when they stopped. To the casual observer, it might have looked like coincidence, but investigators would later conclude that this was the beginning of a targeted attack. A happy moment shattered. Around 2:45 p.m., the Bryants reached a secluded bend of the trail where thick trees blocked the view from both sides. They decided to rest. The kids were laughing, tossing pebbles into the creek. James was unpacking sandwiches. Kimberly was kneeling to take a picture of them when the man emerged from the trees. First, he said nothing. He stood just a few feet away, staring at the family. James, sensing discomfort, asked, "Can we help you?" The man's lips twitched into what might have been a smile, but then, without warning, he pulled a large hunting knife from his pocket. What followed happened so fast that even the children couldn't fully comprehend it. The stranger lunged at James, stabbing him in the chest before he could react. Kimberly screamed and tried to shield the kids, but the attacker turned on her, slashing violently. The sound of children's cries echoed through the forest, followed by the wet thud of footsteps retreating into the trees. A desperate escape. Despite his injuries, James managed to crawl toward his children, urging them to run. Kimberly, bleeding heavily, told them to hide behind the rocks and stay quiet until someone comes. Two hikers, hearing the commotion, rushed to the scene and were met with a nightmare. The couple lying in pools of blood, their children sobbing beside them. One hiker immediately called 911 while the other tried to stop the bleeding, but the wounds were too severe. By the time paramedics arrived, James had died on the trail. Kimberly was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, clinging to life. The manhunt begins. Within minutes, the park was swarming with law enforcement. Officers blocked all exits, fearing the killer might still be inside. Helicopters hovered overhead, and K-9 units swept the forest. The description of the suspect was vague, but officers knew one thing. He was armed, dangerous, and had no hesitation about attacking in broad daylight. This was no random act of wilderness violence. Investigators suspected the killer had been watching his victims long before the attack. And with hundreds of acres of dense forest to search, the clock was ticking. The Devil's Den had gone from a peaceful retreat to a crime scene, and fear was spreading fast. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. The Devil's Den murder wasn't just a shocking crime. It was a nightmare for investigators. The randomness, the brutality, and the fact that children had been left traumatized witnesses made this one of the most urgent cases in the region's history. By now, the scene had been locked down. Yellow tape fluttered in the afternoon wind while uniformed officers guarded the trail entrances. Evidence at the scene. Detectives began their meticulous work. They collected the knife found partially buried in the dirt, a hunting-style blade with dried blood still clinging to its edge. A few yards away, there were footprints leading away from the crime scene. Some were from hiking boots, but others seemed to be from lightweight trail shoes, possibly the killer's. Forensic teams also gathered fibers snagged on branches near where the attacker might have fled. These fibers, reddish in color, could be from the killer's clothing. Blood samples were swabbed from the knife handle and nearby rocks, though it wasn't immediately clear whether all the blood belonged to the victims or if the killer had injured himself in the frenzy. The children's account. The most crucial witnesses were the victims' children. They were shaken, pale, and barely able to speak. Child psychologists were brought in to gently coax out their memories without causing further harm. The kids told a chilling story. A man had appeared suddenly on the trail, as if emerging from the thick brush. He didn't speak much, just muttered something about not being able to go back. Then, without warning, he lunged at their father, stabbing him repeatedly. Their mother screamed and tried to shield them, but she, too, was attacked. The attacker then looked directly at the children, breathing heavily, before suddenly turning and running into the woods. An urgent manhunt begins. With the killer still on the loose, the small town near Devil's Den erupted in fear. Local police called in state troopers, park rangers, and even canine units to scour the area. The park's dense trails and steep cliffs made the search dangerous. Helicopters hovered overhead, using infrared cameras to detect heat signatures. A BOLO, be on the lookout, alert was issued, describing the suspect as a white male in his 30s or 40s, with scruffy hair, a weathered backpack, and possibly wearing a faded red jacket. Authorities urged hikers to avoid the park and nearby forest trails until further notice. Early suspects. Investigators looked into recent reports of suspicious individuals seen at Devil's Denver. One witness claimed they had noticed a lone hiker sitting on a boulder near the entrance the day before, staring intently at passing families. Another reported seeing a man sleeping in a makeshift camp deep in the woods, surrounded by beer cans and torn maps. Background checks were run on known offenders in the area, especially those with violent histories or prior attacks in outdoor settings. Several names came up, but none immediately matched the description provided by the children. The first break. 2 days after the attack, search teams found an abandoned campsite about 3 miles from the murder scene. There were remnants of a small fire, food wrappers, and, most importantly, a torn piece of red fabric caught on a low branch. Nearby, investigators found boot prints matching the size and tread pattern of those at the crime scene. But the most disturbing discovery was a notebook hidden in the tent. Inside were rambling, almost incoherent writings about purifying the land, removing the corrupt, and the watchers in the forest. The last page had a date, just 1 day before the murders, and the words, "They will pay for what they've done." With this chilling find, detectives were more convinced than ever that this was not a random act of violence. The killer had a motive, twisted though it might be, and he might still be lurking somewhere in the vast wilderness. Mounting pressure. As the investigation pressed forward, the public's fear turned into anger. Social media lit up with speculation, theories, and even amateur manhunts, organized by locals. But police warned against interference. Whoever this killer was, he was dangerous, unpredictable, and possibly armed. By the end of the week, one thing was clear. The hunt for the murderer at Devil's Den had become a race against time. If they didn't catch him soon, there was every chance he would strike again. The Texas sun was merciless the morning after the attack, pouring down heat on the thick brush and jagged terrain of Devil's Den State Park. A coordinated manhunt began before sunrise. Local police, state troopers, and FBI agents moved in, working with park rangers who knew every trail, hidden alcove, and animal path. Their target was a killer who had vanished into the wilderness overnight. A man dangerous enough to murder in front of 2 children and cold enough to leave them alive to remember every detail. Helicopters hovered low, their rotors chopping the humid air, while K-9 units sniffed for traces of sweat, blood, or humans sent along the rocky slopes. The suspect had fled on foot, but this was no ordinary jog through the woods. Devil's Den was a sprawling maze of limestone cliffs, dense foliage, and shadowy caves. Authorities feared he could hide for days, or slip out entirely. Witness accounts from the children had already circulated among search teams. "He had wild eyes," one officer repeated to another as they trudged up a steep incline. "And a long knife, maybe a hunting blade." The description was haunting. Tall, lean, unshaven, and moving with the ease of someone used to surviving in the outdoors. By mid-morning, search dogs caught a trail. Officers followed it to a narrow path where boot prints were embedded in the dusty earth. They were fresh, no more than a few hours old. But the trail abruptly ended at a creek, where flowing water erased all tracks. Investigators were forced to think like the suspect. If he was an experienced hiker, he'd know how to use the park's geography to his advantage. That meant caves, cliffs, and abandoned fire towers became prime search spots. One SWAT team rappelled into a deep ravine after spotting movement, but it turned out to be a wild boar. Meanwhile, the community was on edge. Residents near the park locked their doors, kept children home from school, and stayed glued to local news broadcasts. Social media posts shared blurry photos of possible sightings, creating panic and a flood of false leads. The case began to draw national attention. True crime enthusiasts online speculated about the killer's identity. Was he a transient living off the grid? A disgruntled former park worker? Or simply a drifter who snapped? News outlets dubbed him the Devil's Den hiker, a name that made the story even more chilling. Then, just before sunset on the second day, there was a break. A hiker, unaware of the ongoing manhunt, stumbled upon a man crouched behind a fallen tree, clutching a large knife. The hiker fled and called 911. When officers arrived minutes later, the suspect was gone, but he had left behind a backpack. Inside were clues that changed the direction of the investigation. A blood-stained shirt, a pair of boots that matched the children's description, and, most disturbing, a small notebook filled with violent sketches of couples in the woods. It was becoming clear. This attack may not have been random. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but charged with tension. Every eye was fixed on the man in the defendant's chair, Daniel Crowe, the hiker-turned-killer who had shattered a family in the heart of Devil's Den State Park. Dressed in a simple beige jail uniform, his hands shackled, Crowe sat with an expression that teetered between boredom and disdain, as if the trial was merely an inconvenience. The prosecution had spent weeks building their case, presenting DNA evidence from the crime scene, eyewitness testimony from the children who had survived the horror, and surveillance footage from a nearby trailhead camera that placed Crowe at the park hours before the attack. The defense, in contrast, painted him as a man struggling with mental illness and claimed that the murders were a result of a psychotic break, not cold-blooded intent. But the jury wasn't swayed by sympathy. They had seen the crime scene photos, blood staining the leaves, the couple's bodies lying in unnatural angles, the sheer violence of the stabbings. They had heard the 911 call from a sobbing 9-year-old who had watched their parents die. This was not a momentary lapse in reason. It was brutality in its rawest form. The verdict. On the morning of the verdict, the courtroom was overflowing. Reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and local residents filled every bench. The families of the victims sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly together, bracing for the moment they had waited nearly 2 years to hear. The foreman of the jury stood, paper in hand. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The words hung in the air for only a second before sobs of relief and grief mixed into a heartbreaking chorus. Crowe sat motionless, but for the first time, his jaw tightened. Whether it was regret or simply annoyance, no one could tell. Sentencing. During sentencing, the judge's words were sharp and deliberate. You took the lives of 2 loving parents in an act of violence so callous, it will haunt their children forever. The court sees no reason for you to ever walk free again. Life without parole. Crowe would never again breathe the fresh mountain air or walk the trails of Devil's Denver. The only horizon he would know would be the concrete walls of a maximum security prison. Life after the verdict. For the children who had witnessed the murders, healing was a long and painful road. They were placed under the care of relatives, shielded from the media as much as possible. Trauma counseling became a regular part of their lives. But as experts warned, witnessing violence at such a young age leaves scars that never fully fade. The park itself, once a place of beauty, became a haunting symbol of the crime. Tourists returned slowly, but locals admitted that the shadow of the murder still lingered in every rustle of the leaves and every isolated stretch of trail. A crime that changed outdoor safety. The brutality of the attack forced new safety measures in national and state parks. Rangers increased patrols, installed more security cameras, and began pushing awareness campaigns reminding hikers to travel in groups and remain alert. For many, Devil's Den was now a cautionary tale. The final word. As the camera crews packed up and the reporters filed their last stories, the case of the murder at Devil's Den faded from headlines, but it remained burned into the memories of those who lived it. It was a grim reminder that even in the most serene settings, evil can walk quietly on the trail right behind you. The story had no happy ending. Justice was served, but 2 lives were gone forever, and a family was irreparably broken. In the end, all that remained was the echo of that fateful day in the forest, and the knowledge that safety is never guaranteed, even in paradise. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell.